Hey Marielle.
Hey Colin, how's it going?
All right, how are you?
We lined up a pretty depressing episode
We
for
did.
today, and we're trying really hard to not have every episode of this show be a downer. But we
No,
thought, given current events, the sort of accumulation of current events over the past several years, it'd be a good idea to do a depressing episode on this particular topic.
yeah, the problem with art and politics is when all politics are horrific. You're all staring horror in the face at all times.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
And I guess that's what today's episode is going to be about, more or less. So today on Bad Art, we're discussing atrocity images, or more specifically, the sharing and distribution of atrocity images on social media. We want to evaluate what's at stake politically in the production and distribution of these images as imagined as a political mobilization tool. What kind of politics do these images of death produce and imagine?
I think it's worth saying, these images are not usually thought of as art, right?
Mm,
They're thought of as reportage, as
yeah.
witnessing, but we thought that it would be helpful to take a step back from that more immediate relationship that we have with images of violence and atrocity to think about what what are these images doing in society, right? What is
Yeah.
their reception? What is their circulation? What are the circumstances of their production? And so they may not be art with a capital A, but we still think that a lot of the analytic tools that we would oftentimes use to think about art are still helpful for thinking through how these images work.
Yeah. So the day we're recording, sometime last night, I suppose, Israel and Lebanon killed two journalists with targeted strikes. And so their pictures are all over my news feeds. And then in Iran, at some point in the last couple of days, the US and Israel bombed a university. And so the shell of the university has been posted online by people who used to teach or study there. And that's also circulating. So these are a lot of my feed is these images of military atrocity. And it's been kind of a constant feature this past couple years, honestly, of just like kind of nonstop dead bodies in the social media feed
Yeah.
and trying to process how I react to those. What am I supposed to do when there are, you wake up in the morning, you open your internet and there are, 40 casualties staring out at you,
Hmm.
asking you, share this, don't forget this, don't ignore this, don't look away. But I do often look away. I've been trying to put the social media down because I find this stuff really depresses me. But there's been a lot of atrocities.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I guess I'm just thinking, that moral imperative, not just to bear witness to the images, but to do something, right?
Yeah.
To share them. In some ways, it's a little bit surprising that that imperative still exists or that it
Hmm.
holds such force because there has been, over the past 5-ish years, I would say like a real critical reevaluation of the kind of clicktivism
Right.
associated with the 2010s, right? We understand on some level that like arguing with people on social media or sharing images on social media, it's not actually a form of action. It's not
Right.
actually a form of political praxis. And so I guess on some level, I find it surprising that given that broader critique of collectivism, we're still faced with this same conundrum when we encounter these images.
Well, I mean, maybe this is something we'll get to, but I think part of it is people feeling maybe that they don't have another option. Like nothing else you can do, so you should do this. And there's something in the display of atrocity as a mobilization tool that reflects, I don't want to say an impoverished political imagination, but a limitation of options, a sense that there aren't other ways to achieve change. So almost they're almost desperate. I mean, as they should be, I suppose. Like the situations are terrible, but the the fear and desperation which comes across in the sharing of those images is part of their context, and it is a context of political disempowerment.
Right. And dehumanization,
Yeah,
right? The other thing that comes across so powerfully in these images is people reaching out to insist that they are human beings
yeah,
and that this happened to them.
yeah. One thing which I was thinking about and wanted to get to kind of early is that I don't think everyone agrees that you should share these images, you know?
Hmm.
And I've noticed it specifically, it varies from group to group of friends or people I know, or however you want to phrase that. But by and large, and this is a history going back, years and years now, not just to current events, but my Palestinian and Arab colleagues are emphatic about the urgency of sharing the victims of Israeli violence, and it honors them to share them in some way. And on the other hand, with regard to the horrendous violence of that occurs to black people in the United States, many of my black friends will say, please don't share this, photo of a police officer killing someone. It's just traumatic. Why do you need to share and see this? We know what's going on. Right. So there are different strategies. And I then see that get argued about a lot. Well, we need to share it because how else are we going to mobilize people, show them what's happening? People don't know. Like this sort of moral logic gets mobilized and argued about over whether it's politically correct to share or not share these images. So I think that divide is interesting.
Yeah. I do think it's an interesting divide because it points to the longer histories
Hmm.
of images of atrocity as part of politics,
Yeah.
and as part of human rights activism. And this is something that we'll get into a little bit later in the episode. But Black Americans and Palestinians are bringing such different histories of
Hmm.
what these images have meant politically in their lives, right? They're
Yeah.
bringing such different associations to bear on them. I don't know that that can explain like the entirety of that divergence that you see across
Hmm.
these communities, but I think it does point to, something that I'm constantly saying to my students in class is you can't look at an image and know what it means,
Right.
right? The
Yeah.
image itself is not sufficient to tell you the story of its meaning. And I think that with these images of atrocity, that can be a really hurtful thing for
Hmm.
people who share them to hear, right?
Yeah.
Because when you look at these images, if you are mobilized by the cultural scripts around them, they feel transparent.
Right. I mean, so one of the things we were using as a resource in preparing for this episode is Susan Sontag's classic essay regarding the pain of others. And this is one of her major points, right? Is that you can't know what the image does not speak for itself. And so the essay starts out with talking about Virginia Woolf doing anti-war activism in the early 1900s and showing images of people who have been brutalized in war and just saying, if everyone saw this, we would stop having wars. No, if everyone knew what happened in war, it wouldn't happen. And Sontag, of course, raises the question, well, depends on how you contextualize this image, right? If it's an image of the horror of war, perhaps it mobilizes a movement for peace. But if it's an image of the crime that the wartime enemy has committed, then maybe it motivates a desire for revenge. So it could be a cry for peace, but it also could be a cry for revenge. It could be something people look at pornographically. It could be disempowering. It could be like, well, I can't do anything about that. People can have all these reactions, can read these in different ways, and it depends on how they understand what the thing is in itself to begin with. So yeah, so we wanted to think through to start with some examples of famous images and talk about what they show us, and then use that to think through the ideology of behind sharing these images and believing that they are useful mobilization tools. We're going to talk, I guess, about Emmett Till, George Floyd, and Mohammed Dura, different people who were killed in unjust situations, whose images became symbols of the movement around them. And so Emmett Till was a young man, for those who don't know, age 14, who in 1955 went from Chicago to visit family in Mississippi and was killed by some white people in the town and brutally murdered. And his mother staged an open casket funeral, and the photos appeared in Jet magazine out of a desire to show the world what had happened to her son. And the photos are quite brutal. Like his face is badly disfigured. And the and this moment is often credited with helping to mobilize the civil rights movement. So it's viewed as sharing these photos was an important thing for an activist to do because the visibility of the brutality mobilized outrage and led people to get involved. It's often the Emmett Till photo is often used in arguments about whether or not to show George Floyd's murder. And so people will say, "Oh, well, you think you shouldn't do it, but Emmett Till was so important that it." So the metaphorical use for talking about the present is is big.
What about that use of like Emmett Till's story and that larger history? What about that is metaphorical? I'm not sure that I'm following.
Mm. So let's say this. So let's say that the story of Emmett Till being a mobilization point for the civil rights movement is often used to inform contemporary discussions about the Black Lives Matter movement and about the sharing of images of brutality in that moment. I have a quote that I'd like to read. This is from Monument Labs Bulletin. They're doing a project on Emmett Till, and this piece was written by Ralph Eubanks, and it says, "Another moment when we witnessed the fracturing of the facade of white supremacy occurred in August 1955 with the murder of Emmett Till. In 2020, we witnessed rampant police brutality against black men and women. Till's death provided historical parallels for how Americans might navigate that particular cultural moment. There is a long, bright line that connects Mamie Till Mobley's decision to let the world see her son's battered body in his casket, images which Jet Magazine published, to the videos of police brutality many of us viewed on our screens 5 years ago, like the one of the Minneapolis police officer killing George Floyd. Throughout history, visual evidence of the harms of white supremacy has been used to weaken its hold on society, whether that evidence is photographs of lynching or television images of dogs attacking civil rights protesters in Birmingham."
Yeah, not to be, I don't want to be dismissive.
Hmm.
I can see where Eubanks's logic is coming from. But the argument that he's making feels so technologically deterministic to
Hmm.
me because to speak about this history connecting 1955 to 2020 as a continuous thread ignores ignores and doesn't ignore all of the other images of white brutality against Black Americans and especially Black men, all the other images in between 1955 and 2020, right? So, on the one hand, by saying there is a continuous history there, I do think that Eubanks is acknowledging like it's not, it wasn't Emmett Till and then silence and then George Floyd, right? There
Hmm.
were other men who we witnessed violence against, right? But it seems to me that the framing of this repetition of images of white brutality against Black bodies as continuity obscures the ways in which oftentimes those images failed to mobilize publics
Hmm.
in the way that Emmett Till's once had.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you started out your comments by saying it felt technologically deterministic. And I think that's right, to say no doubt these images have value in the way that he sees it. If you are trying to make a case about the continuity of white supremacy and challenges to it. But one thing that's noteworthy about both Emmett Till and George Floyd is that there were strong movements in place prepared to mobilize around those images, right? So
Right.
the civil rights movement did not spring into being with the lynching of Emmett Till. It provided a base where people who were outraged about what had happened to Emmett Till could then participate in building a movement that ultimately succeeded in at least some of its goals. And similarly, the Black Lives Matter movement had been going for almost a decade when Floyd was murdered, right? And so there was already a preparedness to respond that isn't there. Like without the movement in place, the images don't have anywhere to go.
Right. Right. And I think that it's significant that okay, why are we talking about this as technological deter as a ter
Mm,
why are we talking about this as a technologically deterministic interpretation of the situation?
mhm,
It's because what we can see from the mobilization around Emmett Till, around George Floyd, is that it's not just the technology of the photograph or of the video or
mm,
of the magazine where the photograph is published or of the social media channel where the video is shared. That's not what produced the social movements that arose in response, right? It's organizing that produced those social movements. And I do think that the contrast with the Rodney King video is telling there, right?
mhm,
Because I think one of the problems in LA was that there was a lot of popular rage, but there weren't well organized civil society structures for that rage to be channeled into. And so people did what they could, right? And, quite understandably so, but they didn't have that like more formally organized framework for channeling
mhm,
their opposition. I moved to Baltimore the summer of the uprising after Freddie Gray was killed. And I would say it was a similar situation there, right? Where the political leadership class in Baltimore was so completely impotent and corrupt and had been frustrating to people in the city for so long that, when this young man was killed, people knew that they weren't going to get anything by going through the political channels to contest it. And so then what's left to you? Taking to the streets, but in like a not particularly organized way.
mm. And that's interesting because I partly think, George Floyd had organization, but it also had non-organization. Like, one of the things that happened is that many of the businesses along Lake Street, where the third precinct is based, were burnt to the ground by angry protesters who also burnt down the third precinct. You did have more, normal organization. Normal's the wrong word. You have more like, uh,
Normie organizations,
well, I don't want to say that, but you'd have more, um,
like more established organizations.
yeah, more carefully organized political
Mm,
protest also, particularly around George Floyd Square, which was, again, militant, like it barricaded off, but it was cultivated demands, these sorts of things. Like it was more legible, right, than the rage. But I do think the rage mattered. The fact that Minneapolis was burning is what forced political leaders to respond. But it mattered that there was a legacy of the Black Lives Matter movement. That people had
yeah,
been talking about this, that there had been organization around it, that there was also a more formally organized group doing work or groups doing work at the same time that were able to make like more formal demands.
right. Right. And yeah, I think I often ask myself, like, would 2020 have been possible without Ferguson, without Mother Emanuel Church, without Freddie Gray, right? Like, it does feel like each of these moments throughout the 2010s helped to crystallize the movement, even though they were like geographically distributed, but they do have in common that they start with images of violence, right?
Hmm.
It's not just the atrocity. Well, in the case of Michael Brown, it's actually the lack of the image, right, that
Right.
becomes the issue. But yeah, I think not to get too digressive, but this is consistent with the argument that we're making that it's not the image itself that generates a public around it or a change around it. And at the same time, that images can participate in bringing people together, right?
Mm.
So it's not that they're like completely immaterial or anything like that. It's just that they are not the sole driving force that the focus on the image makes it appear to be the case, right?
Right.
And I think especially like, we live in such a visual culture right now
Hmm.
that it can be really easy to think that everything that happens around us is somehow caused by what we see on our phones.
Yeah.
Like it can just feel, and we're very old, so maybe less so for us, but I definitely see it with my students, right? That it often feels to them that whatever is happening in the real world is happening because of things that are happening in the media,
Yeah.
that everything is media all the way down. And I think really part of what we are saying here is like, well, wait a minute. Is it media all the way down? Or are there other social forces at work that can't be reduced to the image and its circulation?
Yeah. So let me throw another thing at you here. Like speaking of the image and shifting perhaps into talking about George Floyd more directly. Jen Jackson has an essay. I mentioned it on the pod before, and I really like it, where she talks about Darnella Fraser's videotaping of George Floyd being murdered and the video as quote unquote rupturing white ignorance. So there's an interesting dialogue there, which is that, black people already know. And Fraser, who filmed George Floyd being murdered, had seen people killed by cops before, had been harassed by police herself. Like, but a claim that putting it out into the ether in these moments of rupture allows or forces white people who maintain ignorance of what's happening to black people to pay attention. I'm curious about that claim. I don't think that's solely explanatory either. But I do think like an interesting thing that she sets up is that there is a base of knowledge which already exists, and there's a maintenance of ignorance. Like I think ignorance for her is not not knowing in itself. It's a willful eliding, a willful not paying attention. So the capturing of attention, I think, is important to her.
I think that's a really useful phrase, the capturing of attention, because where we started this episode was we said that these are images that are so powerful that you cannot look
Mm.
away from them, right? You feel obligated to act. And I think, yeah, I mean, that just like that idea of these are images that capture attention makes so much sense to me, given like the attention economy model that we're in, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious. I don't want to be patting myself on the back. I'm not like a special activist or anything. I rarely do anything. But I am curious. Like I have never watched the George Floyd video. I don't want to. Like I don't want to see someone get murdered. And personally, I didn't need to believe that it had happened or to know what police do. So like I realize I'm not the median target either, right? Like this is a thing I think
Mhm.
about regularly. Like I pay attention to police violence in my everyday life. But I wonder what the claim of not knowing does. Do you know what I mean? I wonder what the claim that you need to see to believe does.
Um, yeah, I mean, just thinking about who is the target viewer for
Hmm.
these images, I agree that you're not the target viewer, obviously, but I think maybe something that we are underappreciating is the extent to which it's youth that are the
Mm.
target viewers.
Yeah.
Just thinking about this idea of the attention economy, the way that these images capture the attention, got me thinking about how the 2020 iteration of Black Lives Matter was really youth driven. You know, when you think about like these tiny towns that were having Black Lives Matter marches, it was often like white students from the local high school who were the ones organizing it, right? And so, yeah, I guess I'm wondering like that claim of ignorance or not
Mm.
knowing, you know, maybe the fact that these are like youth makes a difference there. Not that the youth like are ignorant and like I still buy Jackson's argument that this is about an eliding of what is happening rather than
Yeah.
like some sort of raw state of ignorance. But I do wonder if we have to ask ourselves like, how does this ignorance operate for white youth
Mm.
specifically rather than white people in general?
That's fair. It's funny. So not responding, not responding to the youth because I don't know what to say about it other than obviously their experience is different than mine. But I think that you're saying you said to me that I am not the target viewer, but I was thinking when you said that, but I do sometimes feel like the target sharer, like pay attention to this, tell people about this,
Mm,
so that is a piece of what is like the demand is not just to view, right? The demand is not just to view, but the demand is to keep it in view of others in ways that well, I don't know how I feel about. I mean, obviously I want people to keep talking about George Floyd, keep talking about Black Lives Matter. Do I want to continuously play the video of him being murdered on a loop for decades?
right.
No. You
Do you
know,
want to be a cause-driven social media marketer?
right.
Probably not.
Well, so I'm thinking about, we had Lisa and Amira from Memorialize the Movement in Minneapolis on the pod in like our first or second episode. And there's so much beauty created to commemorate George Floyd as well. Like beautiful art and they were, I don't, I'm going to contradict myself. I don't mean
That's okay. We're
yeah,
growing and learning
yeah,
on the pod.
because on the pod, they pointed out that, a lot of white neighborhoods shared kind of neutral beauty, like messages of peace. That's not what I mean. But I mean like celebrations of Floyd, saying like we can build a better world that is demanded by this is different than the death itself. Even the
Mhm.
rage is different. Like saying, I am angry about this, which many people did. Saying fuck the police. That's a thing that has a different resonance than watching him get killed over and over again. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? That there's a
Yes,
there's a productivity which gets lost in the sticking on the trauma.
right.
So, returning for a second to this question of what does it mean to need to see it, to believe it, to need the image, I've been thinking about this question of permission to narrate. Permission to narrate is a famous Edward Said essay about how no one believes Palestinian claims about atrocity until it can be either proven or an Israeli says that it happened, right? And I think there's a resonance there with Jackson's essay about white ignorance that there is a refusal to believe what black people know about police violence in the US, or a refusal to acknowledge it in any case until we have mobilization around a visible evidence or for some reason white people taking up the cause and narrating it, which is a troubling structural imbalance, that there's an architecture of disbelief built into the system that makes these images feel important because they threaten the the infrastructure of ignorance. Do you know what I mean? The
Hmm.
system that keeps the knowledge of the perpetual violence of the police comfortably out of view.
This is just making me think about Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from O'Malley's.
I don't know it. Tell me.
Oh, God, I'm so sci-fi brained compared to you.
You are much
Uh,
more of a sci-fi reader, but I love hearing about it from you.
So Ursula K. Le Guin, I really like to think of her as an anthropologist working in the science fiction genre.
Hmm.
Um, Quite notably, both of her parents were anthropologists, so this is not like a made-up claim. I think a lot
Yeah.
of anthropologists, we claim Le Guin as one of our own. And this short story, to my mind, displays like such a grounded anthropological knowledge of how atrocities are concealed here on planet Earth. It's a very short story, so I recommend listeners that you Google it and just read it for yourselves. But basically it's told in like this like high fantasy style, this short story.
Mm.
And it's about this perfect city of Omelis and a visitor approaching this city for the first time. And, there's like grand tournaments of knights, pennants flying in the air, delicious food to eat, wonderful music, a parade every day. Like the people who live here are just like fucking happy. They just are having a great time all the time. And it's a perfect society. There's no war, there's no strife. Everyone lives in prosperity, except for one child under the age of 12 who is kept in the dark without food or I don't remember if without food or water, certainly without human contact,
Mm.
in conditions of extreme deprivation. And most people who live in Omelis, they don't really know about this. Maybe they used to know, they kind of forgot. They just go on going to parades, enjoying their feasts. But once in a while, a citizen of Omelis finds out all over again, or for the first time,
Mm.
depending on your interpretation, about the child that's been locked away. And they walk away. And that's the story.
Yeah. Well, I mean that is the story, right? I mean, who knows what will happen in the next several years, but one of the stories of 2020 is that people walked away from that also. Not just politicians who are cowards and who back down on challenging the police, but I mean also public opinion has been swayed back through fear of crime, through a belief in the police.
And through
Um,
a belief in things going on as they always have.
yeah, and we should say, like, investment in the police under Biden, building back up in law and order is part of what gets us to Trump and ICE, is that there is an empowerment of the violent arm of law enforcement that happens. I mean, it's easy to say it happens in reaction, but it happens in this walking away and turning the ignorance back on and, you know, attention being switched somehow.
Right. Like there is this power of these images of atrocity to sort of pierce the veil, but attention can turn off as
Mm,
easily as it can turn on, right?
yeah.
And then what are we left with, right? It's very difficult, even as we have these very iconic images of atrocity, and we remember the victims of those crimes, making durable change is still like it's nowhere near as straightforward, obviously, as sharing an image of
Yeah.
violence, right? I guess I'm also thinking about how images of Holocaust victims, which is like if you think about kind of the history of image technologies and their use in human rights, was not the first, but like one of the earlier examples that we have of the use of these images of atrocity. I recently learned that even though, obviously these were photographs that were taken at the very end of World War II when the concentration camps were liberated. And I think like in contemporary representations of the end of World War II, we often get the impression that like Americans saw those images at the time and, responded with moral outrage to the crimes of the Holocaust that they had been, again,
Mm.
ignorant, but willfully so of during the war. But that isn't true. It turns out that for the first few decades after World War II, the Holocaust was like not at all a matter of knowledge or concern in American public life. Literally, in the article that I read where I learned about this history of Holocaust imagery, there was in Life magazine one photo on the back page of the magazine. It was just not a thing. And it took until the 1970s for what we think of as kind of this knowledge of the Holocaust as a knowledge of images of atrocity to emerge. And so there again, we have an example where, okay, the images had been sitting there, right? The photographs had been sitting there for decades at that point before there emerged kind of a social architecture that could figure out how to make something of them.
That's interesting. What you have me thinking about is the Holocaust was also sort of dismissed as memory in Israel, as we know, and
Hmm.
the in the aftermath, and they blamed the victims of the Holocaust for being weak. There was a claim from Israeli leaders that they were making new Jews, who would not be so easily pushed over.
Stronger Jews.
Stronger Jews, militant Jews,
It was like a very icky eugenic argument. Yeah,
right? And that only really changed with, I mean, the Eichmann trial starts, but it changes later, right? Like where
right.
the idea of the Holocaust as a national trauma justifying Israel's actions becomes part of, like, the survivor stories, the victim stories become something that's incorporated into the national consciousness. And I wonder if that's when it takes off in the US too, is that
Hmm.
a newfound acceptance of talking about it from Jews who might have been embarrassed about it before, it becomes something that's safer to relate to. I don't know if that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's part of it. I guess the other factors, and the article that I read did not go into explaining like why in the 70s did it become suddenly much more legible in the US. But the other two things that come to mind for me are one, American Jewish, and actually not just Jewish, but Americans' reactions to the Six-Day War and then the Yom Kippur War, right? So actually, Joe Biden is a great example of someone who was really mobilized to the Zionist cause at that time period. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that comes to mind is actually the children of survivors wanting to be the ones to break the silence. So it's not so much that the survivors themselves necessarily want to like publicly claim their stories. It's their kids going like, "Wait a minute. This happened to you and I don't know anything about it, right? And I want to make sure that it's remembered not just by me, but by our whole society." And so I don't know, that does make me think about again kind of like these generational orientations toward these images, right? That maybe they like maybe for certain generations they do just like hit different or mean something different. Yeah, I don't know. That's an open question for me, but there's definitely with Holocaust imagery, there's like this marked shift from the survivors generation to the generation that came after.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, and it speaks to the point we raised earlier about Sontag saying, you can't know what this means because it could be an image of your own weakness, right? Or it could be
Hmm.
an image of your overcoming the tragedy. It could be a claim to say, look what happened to me. You need to take me seriously. Like it has all of these. It could be, we need to remember this thing that happened because it's an important part of our family history. Like you've presented all of these as sort of shifting relationships to the Holocaust among Jewish families in the United States, even in a very short period of time, right? So again, there's no inherent this is what this means in these photographs.
And yet, especially in the social media economy, when they're
Mm.
shared, that very much is how you're supposed to take it, right?
Yeah,
This is the one meaning, and that is what makes it incumbent upon you to share it.
yeah. Well, I don't know if I want to bring this up now or not, but it occurred to me. So I think I will. In thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. One other thing that Sontag says is that there's a myth of oversaturation, that you see too many images and you get desensitized. She says that's not what happens. She says that people recognize that nothing is happening and then they become disaffected. And she has this excellent quote in there that says, compassion is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action or it withers. The question is what to do with the feelings that have been aroused, the knowledge that has been communicated. If one feels that there is nothing we can do, but who is we? And nothing they can do either. And who are they? Then one starts to get bored, cynical, apathetic. And it's not necessarily better to be moved. Sentimentality, notoriously, is entirely compatible with a taste for brutality and worse.
God, that's such a good quote.
But I mean, I think you could make claims about the Black Lives Matter movement that at some point nothing was happening. The political class had re-entrenched. And so perhaps some of the loss of interest is that it's not moving. And,
Mhm.
I don't know that that's true, but I feel like there's a read there
I
that
think so.
matters.
It also makes me think about what is, now dismissed as collectivism was partially an effort to create a sense of movement
Hmm.
where movement wasn't happening organically, right? I'm thinking about like hashtag stop Coney or something like that. So I found this article from the BBC, Coney 2012, The Rise of Online Campaigning.
Hmm.
And in like the early 2010s, there was a social media campaign. So this was a social media campaign called hashtag Coney 2012. It was the number one topic of conversation on Twitter at the time. And it was created by a charity that made a 30-minute documentary. And this was the hashtag that they created for the documentary. And I think they were just like trying to like stop Coney. So this is Joseph Coney, who is a Ugandan warlord and the founder of the Lord's Resistance Army.
Hmm.
Like, I don't really remember what the goals of the campaign were, which I think is telling, but it was very much like marketed as like a social revolution that you participate in by sharing the hashtag. It's interesting though, it's like all of this happened in 2012, but I remember that when I was a college student and I graduated in 2010, so a couple of years earlier, this documentary was screened like on my
Hmm.
campus. And I bought the t-shirt. I bought the t-shirt
Nice.
of the campaign, which should tell you A, something about its effectiveness, maybe B, something about my gullibility
Yeah.
as a, you know, an idealistic college student. But
I think it's interesting that you raised this Lord's Resistance Army. I think it's not really the first online campaign because I was immediately thinking of Save Darfur, you know,
oh, that's
um,
true.
which
Yeah.
which happened earlier, but is very similar in that it's, real atrocities, but happening in a distant place where honestly we can do nothing about, right?
Mhm.
So there's a mobilization around something over there, and I'm pretty skeptical of those, like I think they end up mostly reinforcing racism.
White saviorism.
Oh, look at what happens in Africa. Look how much,
Hmm.
we need to go save them, you're right. And the only logical inference, right, save Darfur, the inference is we should invade the Sudan, you know, and that's psychotic, So like as opposed to we should do things about our own problems. You know what I mean? We should rein in the police in one way or another. We should stop funding Israeli atrocities. Like we should not be bombing Iran. These are like real things that we can do. And yet our energy is directed to complaining about the things that other people do over there in places where they're racially different. That's my take on like the Save Africa, the varied
Yeah.
Save Africa
Gosh,
campaigns.
there's a way in which you could paint the migration of social media activism of this type
Hmm.
from Africa, like American social media activism
Hmm.
of this type, from Africa to the United States. There's a way in which you could figure that as a movement that comes about after the collapse of moral justifications for US interventionism abroad,
Hmm.
right? So, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that up until about 2012, give or take, the idea that the US had a moral project of
Mm.
enforcing human rights through military action was largely intact among Americans, right?
Yeah.
Even among Obama's supporters. And I think it was really like in Obama's second term that his supporters, especially the younger supporters, started to be like, wait, but why is Obama bombing all these countries? Is this the model of peace and hope that we thought we were voting into office? And it comes with this disillusionment with the wars, with the American wars in the Middle East, right?
Hmm.
And yeah, I guess I'm thinking like it's not a coincidence that it's around 2012 to 2015 is like the period of time where social media energy goes from being directed at human rights violations in distant lands to human rights violations at home.
And that's interesting. I I heard you say that the humanitarian impulse, and of course, it's also true that, you know, Obama helped raise the profile of Samantha Power, and her whole thing is that the U.S. should use the military to solve humanitarian crisis, should be a benevolent militaristic force, and making the case for U.S. global supremacy through strength, precisely on the basis of these varied atrocities that are happening elsewhere where we can't reach without the military. So it is funny how you're right. This concern translated into kind of permanent warfare.
Thereby generating more dead children, more photos of
Right.
dead children, more compassion when we see these photos that doesn't have a place to go.
Yeah. But I mean, also as with the starving children ads from decades ago, it's very easy to turn it off and say, even though we're doing it, right? It's very easy to turn it off and say, oh, that's
Hmm.
happening over there. That's the thing that happens in Africa. You know what I mean? And
Right. Yeah.
it's a thing that happens in the Middle East.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking about like bring the war home style
Mm,
social movement campaigning. For instance, like the occupations at college campuses in
mhm,
2024, because it's really like those are an effort to say you can't just turn it off, right? You
mhm.
can't just like put your phone away and not see what's happening anymore. We will make sure that on your way to class, you are well and truly aware of what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And there was
Uh,
so much anger at the encampments, right? There was so much
yeah.
anger that they would dare to exist.
That they would dare to exist. I mean, it's funny because I was gonna say, but how different they are from photos, but they were mostly non-intrusive. Like they were in the quad and you could just walk
Yeah.
past them. So it was people saying, I don't want to have to look at this. That was like the big point of contention. And the people who didn't want to have to look at it won because all the kids got beat up and, yeah,
Yeah.
imprisoned or deported or sentenced, threatened
And
to be deported and thrown out of school.
and college administrators said the fact that you would make people look at this is disrupting their ability to go to school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And established a whole new set of very draconian like measures regulating protest on campus pretty
Yeah.
pervasively across the US, including at schools like, UC Berkeley, which prides itself on being the birth of the free speech movement, and can say those two things in the same voice.
At BU last week, the administration took down pride flags that
Mm.
individuals were displaying like in their offices.
As part of the crackdown on political expression, which comes directly
Mhm.
out of the crackdown on encampments, on Palestine encampments.
Exactly. It's the overinterpretation of the neutrality clause.
Well, obviously, I mean, this is going to get us far away, but I have my own thoughts on that. But like the neutrality always favors someone, right? And
Yeah.
the idea of this is clearly being weaponized by Trump to clear out his political enemies, restrict their speech, and enhance
Yeah.
his.
So that makes me think, I guess I'm just thinking like, what is it that these images are supposed to do? Because I feel that we've been like pretty negative and
Mm,
pessimistic about them.
yeah.
Um, but there is like a world in which the images do something. It's
Yeah.
just that like we might not be currently living in that world right now. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was thinking about this in the context of like what you said about how the people who didn't want to look like they won, right?
Right.
And what are kind of we just talked a little bit about basically what are the enabling circumstances of their win, and that it's about this larger structure that predates the encampments that targets pro-Palestine speech specifically, that those laws were already on the books. And I can't remember if nationally before the encampments, but in a number of states they were
Yeah.
already on the books
And on a number of campuses. Yeah.
and on a number of campuses. And then like the way that that weaponization gets turned up, even like dialed up even higher by the Trump administration, right? Like these are the things that make it seem like those who don't want to look are winning, and that like trying to get people to see what's happening is just like this kind of like futile, idealistic effort. But I think there's room there to then talk about like, well, what is the possible utility of these images? Like in what legal and moral universe can they have these claimed impacts? Because we
Mhm.
kind of, like we said earlier, that it's really mostly like mobilization and organizing that like gives the images their power, but it's also not just that.
Yeah. I do think there's something about like the utility. Like, I mean, there's the legal utility, right? These are evidence. But then, Sontag raises the question, should it only be shown to legal experts? Obviously not, right? Like there has to be a part of a campaign where these are demands for something different, demands for a better world. But I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and also like, you know, I I kind of think that that's a little bit of a straw man by Sontag. Sorry,
Mm.
Susan
Oh,
Sontag.
no, it totally
Um,
is. She dismisses that out of hand. Yes.
yeah, I mean, I think like quite obviously one of the ways that justice works is that it has to operate publicly, as
Mm.
in view of the public, right? At least in our like very American conception of justice, right? That's why we have juries, for instance. That's why
Yeah.
reporters are allowed in courtrooms, things like that, is because we don't want only the people deciding the case to see the evidence and
Mm.
know what what the crimes were and where the allocation of guilt lies. We want there to be a social process where we come together to evaluate evidence and judge guilt or innocence. And I think that that legalistic framework of evidence, like yes, it operates through courtrooms, but in in our actual
Mm.
society, it doesn't only operate through courtrooms, right? I'm thinking about like Arendt's writing on Eichmann, right? The like there was a trial, but the trial was maybe not the most important part in sort of the achieving the popular sense of justice and injustice and drawing a line between them.
Yeah. I think there's something interesting here. Like the Eichmann, as we were saying earlier, right? One of the things that it changes is Israelis' relation to the history of the Holocaust, relation to evidence. Like, I mean, there's a bigger thing that happens in the Eichmann trial, sociologically. I'm interested in, we've been saying that the campus protesters lost. That may be too blunt. I'm wondering, like, what is the use of these images? Well, one of them is to fight over what is sayable or not. If like me, you don't take free speech as an abstract idea very seriously, as you see how it is used or misused, but there is a debate over what are you allowed to say in public, what claims can be made, what claims can be recognized, what claims get taken seriously. This is a domain of real political work, and give the students some credit. You know, Gavin Newsom on some fascist podcast the other day did say, that Israel was an apartheid state, and he walked it back later. But
Of course he did.
yeah, he's a coward. But
But he said it, and that's
but
not nothing.
they've all been hedging and humming, but but the Democratic Party recognizes that they can't ignore it in the way
Hmm.
that they have before. That that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but their willingness to take tepid stances of demands for justice is a win of
Yes.
a kind, and it has changed. On the one hand, it's become much more legally and politically perilous to talk critically about Israel than even it was
Hmm.
before. On the other hand, politicians are recognizing that they can't not do it because the political cost is very high. So
Right.
there is something there about what makes it into public discourse.
Yeah, and that is very obviously an area where there's been a lot of change in like what both parties actually are forced to acknowledge about
Hmm.
Israel in quite a short period of time. And, I think part of that is due to Israel's own actions, but the other part is due to this kind of relentless social media campaigning.
Yeah, it's worth asking this question because we've talked before on the pod, this conservative belief that news reporting on Vietnam is what lost Vietnam,
Hmm.
not the Vietnamese army. Um, it's it's success in
It's all
defeating,
it's all spectacle all the way
right?
down.
But I mean, you also have this belief, right? Rumsfeld in Iraq is like Al Jazeera showing images of both Iraqis and Americans dying is treasonous, that
Hmm.
it is somehow like a war effort on its own. I certainly think there's a mistake there, like that the war is a real thing, and that it's not simply won on the battlefield of ideas. Do you know what I mean? Like I think, but it is what is the mediation role? It's not zero, but I also don't think it wins or loses your cause for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that was on my mind earlier when we were thinking about this episode is the creation of publics and counterpublics
Hmm.
organized around the practice of witnessing.
Hmm.
Um, so there, it becomes more like, okay, well, the media is, yes, it's the technology that makes witnessing possible, right?
Hmm.
Without mass media, it is, you know, very difficult to witness atrocities that don't take place right in front of you, right? So
Yeah.
the idea of an international practice of witnessing sort of relies on media technologies in that way. But yeah, I like the idea of focusing on practices of witnessing because it takes the attention off of the media technology
Mm.
that at the end of the day, like at the end of the day, the media technology is just providing like the raw goods for whatever social practice people are going to do with those
Yeah.
items, right? Whereas if we think about witnessing as, as a practice that is organized socially, that has embedded meanings and beliefs, that has a sense of narrative to it, often narratives involving justice.
Mm.
I think that, to my mind, holds a lot more explanatory power for what we see with these images than just thinking about the media technologies involved.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. I like paying attention to the practice, to the community. Yeah, what we do with these is more important than what they are. Yeah, so I wanted to talk. I mentioned that I, never watched the George Floyd video, but a video that I have seen that actually did, I think, make a great impact on me is the murder of Mohammed Dura in September of 2000 by the Israeli army. And so I was studying it in an abroad program at the time. I was in Jerusalem, and this is when the Second Intifada was just beginning. So, and the collapse of the Oslo Accords. So there had been peace accords; they were being negotiated, and a right-wing Israeli politician named Ariel Sharon deliberately provoked Palestinian protests, saying he's associated with massacres of Palestinians in the past, and he forced his way into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Palestinians protested his presence.
And by forced his way in, let's be clear, he like brought soldiers into the mosque. He brought Israeli soldiers into the mosque.
He staged a military invasion of the mosque, although not like no shots were fired at that time, but like forced his way in. And Palestinians protested, and then the soldiers shot the protesters. And then there were new protests, and the soldiers shot the protesters. And this began like a cycle that lasted for, this is the beginning of the thing, but for a couple of weeks, there were regular protests, regular murder of protesters. And occasionally, some Palestinians with weapons did fire back, but I don't want to.
But there was not an equality of forces.
There's a strong imbalance of firepower and death.
Yeah.
And Mohammed Dura was a 12-year-old boy who was out with his father who got caught in one of these firefights. And reporters and others covering it believe that the Israeli military targeted him intentionally. So shot and killed this 12-year-old boy who died in his father's arms. And it's a terrifying thing to watch. And his devastated father, like holding his body, trying to shield him from the gunshots. So I remember seeing that and being
Mm,
really impacted, like this is horrible. And also just like in this question space of why are they doing this? Like why do they
mm,
keep killing people? Because it was this time when they were supposed to be reaching peace, and instead they kept murdering protesters and innocent people like Dura. And it was an interesting time because it was also in the US media. You could see that they were as confused as I was,
mm.
and there was like a period of about 2 weeks where the US media was just like, what the hell is going on? Very critical of Israel. And anyway, I'll just say like Mohammed Dura's picture became an image of the Intifada. So we talked before about, the rise of the 24-hour news cycle in the Middle East. Like this image got replayed lots and lots. It got, put into political music videos. It was put on T-shirts to show solidarity. Like it, just like this image circulated aggressively as like an image of the brutality of the Israeli occupation and the justness of Palestinian response. But the other piece of the story that I wanted to tell is that so 2 weeks later, so he was murdered on the 30th of September. 2 weeks later, on the 12th of October, two Israeli soldiers who were dressed in Palestinian clothes were in Ramallah and got arrested and put into a cell for their safekeeping. It's like, you're going to get killed. You should not be here. Well, a Friday protest was going on, or I don't know if it was a Friday, but a big protest over what had just happened. And the mourners broke into the prison and lynched these two soldiers who clearly were there as soldiers, although they claimed to be, off duty, just wandering into a military zone. And, but the image, I mean, also a horrible image. Like their bloody corpses were like hung from the police station. And that was like the breaking point. Like
Mm.
at that moment, all US media coverage flipped. It became like the, angry hordes of Palestinians out of control, murdering random Israelis. Everything that Israel had done in the previous 2 weeks was immediately retroactively justified. And the narrative shifted and it was gone forever. Like the idea that it became, Palestinians not wanting peace, all of these stories that we still hear. And that was the start of the Intifada. It was these two images of death, which, don't, I mean, if we're talking about what they do or don't reflect, as we said, there's no balance in the number of casualties, the firepower, or anything else. But the way these two images worked in the media had like really incredible effects on the way that people related to the uprising in the U.S. and in the Middle East, because
Mm.
Dura's image continued to be a spark of outrage for years afterwards.
And I would add that this is another example, I think, of why it's important to look at witnessing as a practice, because I'm thinking about how a majority of Americans at the time of the Kent State massacre
Hmm.
thought that the military was justified in killing the protesters.
Right.
And so I guess what I'm saying is like the idea that Americans would like not be that moved by the murder of protesters. It's like, well, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe we're not.
Yeah. I mean, well, that is one of the things that comes up. I think we've mentioned it before in in Palestinian arts especially is like witnessing has proven incapable of resolving the problem. That if you're witnessing Palestinian death and harm and displacement and disaster, were all it would take to mobilize the world to resolve the situation, that has not occurred. So so witnessing
Yeah.
has lost a lot of credibility actually in Palestinian activist and artist circles. Because yeah, it doesn't have the effect you assume it would have.
And yet, to kind of come full circle to where we began this conversation, you had said that the Palestinians that are part of your community find it really important to share these
Yeah,
images, right? And I think clearly, like, they're aware of the ways in which witnessing has fallen short of the goal of liberation in the
right.
past. And so I guess my question to you is like, why do you think, because it's clearly not just about like political strategy. So why do you think that they are still asking for this in particular, for these images to be
Hmm.
shared?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I do think this is there are a few things. One is that the victims of Israeli and other colonial violence are honored slightly differently. So there is a open decision just in general to honor their lives as icons within Palestine as evidence of the justness and heroism of the struggle, whoever they are. So people who are innocents killed as bystanders are still given a special place as representatives of the society. And so I don't know that that's a full answer. I think we were talking at the beginning about like powerlessness, and I don't want to declaim all agency, but I think part of it is just a sense of hopelessness. Like, you know, we have to, why is no one doing anything about this? What else can we do?
Mm.
Um, and then I think there is like a sense that this is evidence, right, of justness, even if it's not a mobilize, maybe it doesn't mobilize, maybe it doesn't work to get people, but it is evidence that you are just and the oppression you're facing is real, whatever anyone else says. So a maintenance of like this idea of self as someone who deserves to live, I think is probably a part of it.
And it almost sounds like maybe also a hope for justice in the future, right?
Mm,
That justice may be deferred in the short term, but
mm,
that there's still value in preserving this evidence and surfacing it to the
yeah,
world. Yeah.
yeah. Hmm. There's so much that we haven't said.
Oh yeah.
I feel like this has been a very good discussion, but I do feel like, well, oh, the idea of the victim, right? Like
Mm,
that there is also, no one wants to be seen as a victim. They want to be seen as agents, and yet one of the things these photographs do is like create that victim story, powerlessness, asking for saviors. So how do people like in using these images to demand justice avoid that
mm.
disempowerment?
Do you think part of the way that maybe people avoid that feeling of disempowerment is because, in fact, being the person to share the image of the victim is itself kind of a heroic position, right? Like you were saying,
Mm,
the victims are heroes, but also being the person to demand justice for them, particularly particularly like against all odds, right?
yeah.
And in situations where that doesn't seem like the most likely thing is a heroic position. I mean, I'm thinking about like Emmett Till's mother,
Hmm.
I think was like widely recognized as a hero for
Yeah.
what she did, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting. The photos in Jet, like it's not just the open casket, but it is the photos of the grieving mother, like in her distress, being held up by a community that are part of that story as well, right? We
Yeah.
remember Emmett Till, but like her mother is just as big a part of that story and of the
Yeah.
response to it. And you're right. Yeah, she did. And she was mentioned in that quote we read, right? Like she is a hero for sacrificing herself in order to share this thing that had been done. Wow. All right. What else?
I just want to put it out there that we literally didn't even get to half our outline.
I know.
No, I mean, I'm just saying it to the listeners.
Oh, you're telling the listeners, yeah. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
I do feel like I mean there are big things we didn't talk about, which is okay.
Is there anything like, I mean, yeah, I agree with you. Is there anything that we want to make sure we do fit in?
Well, let me just mention, because it's a thing that fucks me up, is that often the so-called bad guys also share these images. You
Mm,
know, we read that quote. One of the things he mentions is lynching images, but the lynching images were produced by the people who participated in lynching, so they could say, "Look, I was there," and they shared them as postcards and they sold them. And today, you know, Alex Priddy gets killed by ICE, and the Illinois University Student Republican Club uses that image as like a promotion of like their political platform in a positive way. Like, look what we can do to the libs, So
mhm.
there's not an inherent morality to the images themselves. And if we've been talking at a wider remove about like how fascists love the image of war and death, right? That
Yes,
this is not inherently an impediment to their project unless there is a political community built to make it so.
right. You said that like the existence of the images doesn't determine like how they'll be shared or what they
Yeah.
mean, right? Which I Colin, I take your point as kind of a buyer beware
Hmm.
almost.
Yeah.
That, because we constantly hear and have since the 2024 election that Democrats need to embrace the attention economy, that we need our own counter to like right wing manosphere, like YouTube podcast hosts, our own counter to like shit posting on Twitter. And I think what you're raising is like, of course, these incredibly brutal images are a way to command attention, but what are the politics that accompany those images, right? And so we have talked about examples where there is a productive politics that comes out of those images, like in the case of Emmett Till or in the case of George Floyd. But we also are aware of all of the ways in which images can be destructive, right?
Yeah.
They can be destructive of our sense of like humans having dignity and souls. And I'm thinking about like, not to get like all prudish, but maybe to get a little bit prudish. There's all of those like videos that remix not so much the actual moment of Charlie Kirk's
Mm.
assassination, but more so like that guy who was like live streaming and like caught it on tape, and
Mm.
then we see like him like being like, oh shit, what's happening, and run away. And so there's like all of these videos out there like remixing that live stream and like making it funny. And often they're like from like a left-wing perspective, but I feel so horrible whenever I happen to come across one of them, right?
Yeah.
Because it is like this gleeful response to political violence. And yeah, and I'm left wondering like what coalition does this build, right?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I mean, perhaps one organized around violence.
Yeah,
Um,
perhaps.
so as you were talking, I had one last thought. I think maybe this will be a point to end it, which is just these images are incredibly traumatic, or for many. And one of the things that I was looking at as we were working on this is Darnella Frazier, who recorded the image of George Floyd, was a freaking teenager, and her life has been upended by this experience. So I was reading a thing that she said. I am 18 now, and I still hold the weight and trauma of what I witnessed a year ago. It's a little easier now, but I'm not who I used to be. A part of my childhood was taken from me. My 9-year-old cousin who witnessed the same thing I did got a part of her childhood taken from her. Having to up and leave because my home was no longer safe. Waking up to reporters at my door. Closing my eyes at night only to see a man who was brown like me lifeless on the ground. I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. I used to shake so bad at night my mom had to rock me to sleep, hopping from hotel to hotel because we didn't have a home and looking over our back every day in the process. having panic and anxiety attacks every time I see a police car, not knowing who to trust because there are a lot of people who are evil with bad intentions. I hold that weight. A lot of people call me a hero, even though I didn't see myself as one. I was just in the right place at the right time. Behind this smile, behind these awards, behind the publicity, I'm just a girl trying to heal from something I'm reminded of every day. And yeah, I shouldn't say anything. Should just let her have the last word.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great place to end. You've been listening to Bad Art. I'm Mary Grushko.
I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody.